never forget the look on his face that day. He was scared. There's something about this cave. He won't come in.
What is up, everybody? Jeremy Icenfire here, and welcome to the channel. The highly anticipated 5th and final season of Stranger Things has officially arrived, as we recently received Volume 1 of 3, which consists of the first 4 episodes of the final season. And with it, not only came some new and intriguing revelations, but also some interesting new questions as well, not the least of which being what exactly is Vecna really up to. Something that Volume 1 certainly begins to touch on, but also leaves far more questions than answers. And while Vecna certainly is a formidable villain and oftentimes comes across as omnipotent and nearly indestructible, we did however learn in Volume 1 that there is a small chink in his armor that our protagonist could go on to exploit, as the show has hinted at exploring one of Vecna's deepest and darkest fears. A traumatic event from Vecna's past that is not only tied to his incredibly tragic childhood, but also to the very origins of his powers. An event that became the very catalyst for setting Henry Creel on the path to becoming Vecna. In Episode 4, we learned a little bit more about Max's backstory and how she ended up in Vecna's mindscape, the same mindscape that Holly herself is now trapped in as well. And while Max is retelling her story about how she arrived here to Holly, we learn a very interesting detail about Vecna, and how Max believes he wouldn't enter the caves to pursue her out of fear. Fear for what these caves ultimately represent, and how they are directly tied to Vecna's backstory and the origins of his power. While the show does initially touch on the origins of how Henry Creel becomes Vecna at the hands of Eleven, the show doesn't exactly touch on the very origins of Henry's powers in the first place, and his initial encounter with Dimension X and the Mind Flayer. And of course, why these caves in particular represent the ultimate symbol of fear to Vecna. But in order to understand the full significance of the caves, we first need to understand a little bit more about the early years of Henry Creel. Henry was born in 1947 to parents Victor and Virginia Creel, and also had an older sister named Alice. Henry was described as a very sensitive child and a bit of an outcast among his peers, and at a very early age, developed a misanthropic view of humanity. And while it's said he was born with innate psychic abilities, it was in these caves in which his life would truly change forever. Growing up in Nevada, at the age of 8, Henry was a young Boy Scout, eager to explore his surroundings. One day, when exploring a nearby cave system, Henry would accidentally stumble upon stolen government technology. Technology that was stolen by a rogue scientist involved in Dr. Brenner's Project Rainbow, which was Brenner's attempt at recreating the Philadelphia experiment and trying to achieve invisibility. The technology stolen by the rogue scientist was stashed in a nearby cave system, where an 8-year-old Henry would accidentally stumble onto it and activate it, transporting him to an alternate dimension, where Henry would go on to experience true darkness for the first time. During the 12 hours in which he was missing, Dimension X would go on to fundamentally change Henry forever, as he would have his first encounter with the Mind Flayer. Yet this earlier version of the Mind Flayer wasn't exactly the one that we know, but was rather simply a storm-like organism of swirling particles. It wasn't until much later, after Henry had fully become Vecna, that he would reshape the Mind Flayer into the shape that we know on the show, giving it its spider-like form. This earlier version of the Mind Flayer, however, made a strong psychic connection to Henry's mind, not so much possessing him, but rather corrupting him, and causing intense psychological trauma. This exposure drastically altered Henry's personality, and even went on to change his very DNA, as he would return from his time in Dimension X with an all-new and very unique blood type, and with his innate psychic abilities being drastically enhanced, leading him to connect to the hive mind of the Mind Flayer. And while Henry survived the 12-hour ordeal, he was forever changed by the encounter. The Mind Flayer would often communicate with Henry telepathically, appearing in visions and in forms he was familiar with in order to manipulate him. The entity began fostering his darker nature, and fed into the god complex that he was developing, encouraging him to embrace his powers. Seeking a fresh start, his family would then move from Nevada to Hawkins, Indiana. But unfortunately for Henry, his mind was already too far gone. Already beginning to develop a superiority complex, Henry began feeling misunderstood and an outcast among his own family, as they often thought of him as broken, leading Henry to embrace his darkness even more. Then, on one fateful day, Henry's mother discovered he had powers. Not knowing how to handle it, she contacted Dr. Brenner in order to have him treated. But with Henry being a mind reader, he quickly found out about his mother's plan, and in fear of being experimented on, Henry planned on killing his entire family and pinning the murders on his father. But after killing his mother and his sister, Henry would go on to collapse from exhaustion, leaving his father as the only survivor, who ended up getting sent to a mental institution after the murders, while Henry himself fell into a coma. At which point, Dr. Brenner faked Henry's death and transported him to Hawkins' lab to be experimented on, where he would officially become test subject number 1. And it was through Henry's unique blood that all of the later test subjects gained their powers, including 11. But for Henry, all of the trauma and torment that he suffered originated at these caves, which would go on to represent the loss of humanity and his loss of individuality, marking the true beginning of Henry's transformation into Vecna. For Henry, these caves represent everything that he lost, and stands as a constant reminder of all of the trauma and torment that was inflicted upon him by the Mind Flayer, marking the very beginning of him losing his humanity, and explains why even all these years later, he is still afraid to enter the caves, as they represent the very darkness that once corrupted him, a traumatic time from Henry's past that they could potentially use against him, with these caves being one of the few weaknesses that Vecna has. So if nothing else, it should be interesting to see what kind of role they're going to play throughout the rest of the season, and if they can be used against him. But there we have it, folks, the full explanation as to why Henry really fears the caves, and the important role they played in his origin. And definitely leave your thoughts and comments down below. Do you think the caves could be used against Vecna at some point in the future? But if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to smash that like and hype button, and be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all of our upcoming content. And as always, I want to give a big thank you to everybody out there for watching, and a huge thank you to all the channel members. Keep those tinfoil hats on, folks, and I will see you on the next one.